stand here today, again, letting you know that Mya Fuller was and will always be the light in my eyes, the light in my family eyes, as she did not deserve what happened to her. It was despicable, it's still despicable, and these people walk around and try to defend these folks, and you have no idea. She just went to a party. Just went to a party. That's it. And you didn't even give her the grace to just beat her, or just to even call the cops. You stood there, walked away, threw your hands up. And you get 12 years? 30% served? My God. I say to any family members that find themselves in a place where my family members are, the first thing is we are law-abiding citizens. So the law is first. We are not going to do anything to jeopardize law. But if you are in this situation, please ensure that you have the right representation, that you do your due diligence outside of that representation to ensure that you're getting the justice needed for your family. So Tyshawn, consider yourself lucky.
7 gunshots in an empty field outside Lebanon, Tennessee. A 22-year-old woman folded into the trunk of a car she should never have gotten near. A party invitation that was never a party at all. This is a story of how one disagreement, words exchanged and already forgotten by one side within hours, ended with 3 people under the age of 21 deciding a stranger's life wasn't worth continuing. By the time this video ends, you'll know exactly how a friend request became an ambush and why the justice system's final answer left even her own mother unable to accept it. Before we get into who Mya really was, I want to be upfront about something. Right now, on this channel, we have a lot more people watching these investigations than we do people actually subscribe to follow them. If you're new here, that gap is the only thing standing between us and covering more cases like this one. With this level of depth, it costs nothing. It takes 2 seconds, and it tells us you want the full story followed all the way through, not just a headline. Hit subscribe now, and let's get into it. Before this becomes a story about a trunk, a field, and 7 bullets, it needs to be a story about a person, because that's the part true crime coverage gets wrong more often than not. Somewhere between the headline and the mugshots, the victim disappears from her own story. We're not doing that here. Not with Mya. Mya Fuller was 22 years old, from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, a college town about 30 minutes southeast of Nashville. The kind of place where everybody's either headed into the city for work or just getting back from it. She wasn't famous. She wasn't a public figure. She was somebody's daughter, somebody's co-worker, somebody's friend on a Saturday night out. And by every account from the people who actually knew her, she was sharp. Her own mother, Taiyana Fuller, called her a genius. And if you listen to how Tanya says it in courtroom footage later in this video, you'll notice she doesn't say it like a proud parent exaggerating. She says it like a fact she's stating for the record. Mya worked, not in some abstract, resume line way, but actively, consistently, the kind of steady effort that doesn't make headlines because it isn't supposed to. She'd picked up a shift at Geodis Park, the Nashville Soccer Club stadium, the kind of job a lot of 20-somethings in that city take on. Event staff, game day work, on your feet for hours, dealing with crowds, then home. It's not glamorous. It's also exactly the kind of ordinary responsibility that tells you everything about a person's character before any tragedy ever touches their name. She was close with her family. That detail matters more than it might sound like on paper, because it's going to come back later when we get to the exact weekend this happened. Mya wasn't estranged from anybody. She wasn't the kind of daughter whose family had learned to expect silence for days at a time. When she went quiet, it was immediately, viscerally wrong, and everyone who loved her knew it within hours, not days. At her plea hearing years later, one of the men responsible for what happened to her would describe meeting Mya for what was, by his own account, the very first time in his life, less than 24 hours before she died. Sit with that for a second, because it's going to be the spine of everything that follows in this video. Mya Fuller did not have a history with the people who killed her. She didn't have an enemy in any real sense of the word. What she had was one conversation, one disagreement, on one Friday night, with a woman she'd never met before and would never see socially again. And within roughly 24 hours, that conversation had been turned deliberately, methodically, into a death sentence. That's the detail that should stop you cold before we go any further. This isn't a story about a relationship gone wrong, or a grudge that built over months, or a love triangle, or a debt. This is a story about how fast cruelty can move when three people decide together that it's going to. It's worth taking a moment to think about what Mya's life actually looked like in the weeks before all of this happened, because true crime coverage tends to skip straight from victim to crime scene without ever letting the audience sit in the ordinary rhythm of a life that was, by every account, going exactly the way it was supposed to. Mya was 22, which meant she was living through the specific stretch of adulthood where most people are still figuring out who they're going to become. A job, a routine, friends, family dinners, the small, repeating structure of a normal week that nobody thinks to appreciate until it's gone. She had that. She was building that. Murfreesboro itself matters to the story too, not just as a location on a map, but as context for who Mya was. It's a college town, home to Middle Tennessee State University, close enough to Nashville that a lot of young people who grow up there end up splitting their lives between the two, working in the city, coming home to family on the weekends. That's exactly the rhythm Mya's life followed. A shift at a Nashville venue, a night out with people from that same social world, a drive home to Rutherford County where her family was waiting. Nothing about that pattern was unusual, dangerous, or reckless. It was simply what being 22 and building a life in Middle Tennessee looked like in the summer of 2022. That context matters because it directly undercuts any narrative that tries to suggest Mya did something unwise by accepting an invitation to a public nightclub from someone in her extended social circle. She didn't sneak out. She didn't lie to anyone about where she was going. She didn't take an unnecessary risk by any reasonable standard. She went out on a Saturday night the exact same way millions of 22-year-olds do every single weekend. And the difference between her story and theirs has nothing to do with any choice she made. It has everything to do with three other people's choices, made deliberately over the course of an entire day. The last weekend of July 2022 looked, from every angle we have access to, completely unremarkable. That's not filler. That's the point. It's what makes it unbearable to sit with in hindsight. Friday, July 29th, Mya spent time with her family. That's the confirmed detail from the Wilson County Sheriff's Office timeline, released later at an official press conference. Family members confirmed this was the last time they saw her. Not a dramatic goodbye, not a warning sign, in hindsight, just an ordinary Friday, the kind you don't think to memorize because you assume there will be another one next week. Saturday, July 30th. Mya worked her scheduled shift at Geodes Park for the Nashville Soccer Club. Clocked in, did her job, clocked out. If you've ever worked event staff for a professional sports venue, you know what that day looks like. Long, physical, unglamorous, forgettable in the best possible way. Nothing about that shift suggested anything except that Mya Fuller was, as always, showing up and doing the work. But here's where the timeline splits into two separate stories happening at once. And this is where the true horror of this case starts to take shape. While Mya was working that shift, somebody else was already online, searching her name, scrolling through her social media profile, looking for a way in. We need to rewind 24 hours to explain why. The night before Friday, July 29th, Mya crossed paths with a 21-year-old woman from Nashville named Taiyana Tipton. According to everything that's come out in court since, the two of them got into an argument. Nobody involved in the prosecution of this case has ever laid out, publicly, word for word, exactly what was said. And frankly, based on everything we now know about how this ended, the specific content of that argument barely matters. What prosecutors have said consistently is that it was a kind of disagreement that happens constantly in every city on every weekend between people who don't know each other well. No weapons involved. Nobody was physically hurt. Words were exchanged, and then, as far as either woman's actions immediately after suggest, everybody went their separate ways. For Mya, that's exactly where it ended. She went home. She woke up the next day and went to work her shift at Geode's Park like nothing had happened, because as far as she was concerned, there's nothing in public record, nothing from friends, family, or investigators, to suggest Mya gave Taiyana Tipton a second thought after that Friday night. She had a normal Saturday ahead of her. She lived it that way. For Taiyana Tipton, it did not end there, not even close. This is the exact point where the story stops being about an argument and starts being about a plan. Somewhere over the course of that Saturday, while Mya was finishing a stadium shift and getting ready for what she thought was going to be a good end to her week, Taiyana Tipton made a decision. According to the case laid out by prosecutors and detailed publicly by the Wilson County District Attorney's Office, Tipton decided Mya was going to pay for that argument physically. There was a problem, though, and it's a problem that tells you this was an impulsive decision made in a single furious moment. Mya knew Taiyana's face. If Taiyana had reached out to Mya directly, Mya would have recognized her instantly and been on guard. Whatever was coming needed a different approach. It needed someone Mya had never seen before. Someone who could message her looking completely harmless. Taiyana Tipton turned to her own younger brother. Tyshawn Bowles was 20 years old. According to prosecutors, he knew about the argument between his sister and Mya from the night before. He knew, going into that Saturday, that his sister wanted to confront her. And knowing all of that, according to the case laid out in court, Bowles opened social media, searched until he found Mya Fuller's profile, a young woman he had never met and who had never done a single thing to him, and sent her a message. There was a party that night. He told her, Island Vibes, a nightclub on Antioch Pike in South Nashville. Think about that invitation from Mya's side of the screen for a second, because this is the mechanism that makes this entire case so disturbing. A nightclub is public. It's loud, it's crowded. There are cameras at the entrance. There's security working the floor. Nothing about an invitation to a club screams danger, and the message came from someone with no visible, obvious connection to the argument from the night before. At 22 years old, invitations like this arrive constantly. Promoters posting flyers. Friends of friends passing your name along. People you half know from a shared social circle reaching out about something going on that night. Saying yes to a message like that isn't reckless. It's completely, unremarkably normal. That's the part of this case that should genuinely unsettle you. The plan never depended on Mya making a mistake. It depended entirely on her doing exactly what any young person would reasonably do with a free Saturday night ahead of them. She said yes. And here's something worth sitting with before we move forward. This wasn't a split-second, heat-of-the-moment decision on anyone's part. There was time built into every single step of it. Taiyana Tipton had all day Saturday to cool off from Friday night's argument, and by every indication in the public record, she did not. Tyshawn Bowles had to actively search for a stranger's profile online, study it, compose a message, send it, and then keep that lie running while Mya decided whether or not to come. At any single point in that sequence, either one of them could have stopped. Neither one did. There was a third person involved in what was coming. Myra Pipkins, 20 years old, closely connected to both Tipton and Bowles. When the moment arrived that night, she would not be standing on the sidelines watching. So picture the pieces moving into position as the sun went down over Nashville that Saturday evening. Mya, fresh off a long shift, getting ready for what she believed was simply a good way to end her week. Taiyana Tipton waiting, having carried a grudge for a full 24 hours without it cooling even slightly. Myra Pipkins, ready to back her up, and Tyshawn Bowles, the friendly stranger who had baited the invitation, watching to see if Mya would actually show. Mya got dressed. She headed out. She drove toward Antioch Pike, toward the music, toward the lights, with absolutely no way of knowing she was driving directly toward 3 people who had spent the entire day preparing for her arrival. I want to pause here for a second before we go into what happened at that club, because this next section is difficult, and I think it deserves your full attention rather than a scroll past. If this channel's coverage is doing what we're setting out to do, actually explaining these cases with real depth instead of just reciting headlines, then take a moment right now and subscribe so the next video like this one actually reaches you. We've got thousands of people watching these breakdowns, and only a fraction sticking around to follow the channel, and that's a gap only you can close.
I plead guilty, sir.
And is this your decision?
Yes, sir.
Are you pleading guilty because you are guilty?
Yes, sir.
I find that you're competent. I find there's a factual basis. Plead to be freely and voluntarily entered your decision knowingly and intelligently made. In the matter of 23 CR 480, do pronounce you guilty of felony murder and first degree murder, sentence you to life sentences on each of those. Also pronounce you guilty of the offenses of kidnapping and abuse of a corpse.
All right, let's go back to that parking lot. Antioch Pike, Saturday night, late July. Cars packed into the lot outside, island vibes. Bass thumping through the walls. Small groups laughing between bumpers in the dark the way they do outside every club in every city on a Saturday night. Mya Fuller walked into that scene exactly the way she walked into 100 nights like it before. Phone in hand, looking for whoever had invited her, expecting nothing worse than maybe a long line at the door. She arrived a little after 11 p.m. There was no party waiting for her the way the message had promised. What was waiting for her was Taiyana Tipton. At some point, Mya ended up back outside in that parking lot, away from the crowd and the lights inside the club. And that's where it happened. Witness accounts, later relied on by prosecutors, described Tipton and Lamira Pipkins attacking Mya together, 2 against 1, in a dark lot, deliberately away from the venue's entrance and its cameras. Here's something worth knowing about Mya Fuller, and it's a detail her family and coach would later speak to directly. She did not go down easy. She fought both of them, a 22-year-old woman, ambushed and outnumbered 2-1, fighting for her life in a place she had every reason to believe was safe. But 2 attackers working together against 1 person who had walked in expecting a party only ever ends one way. According to medical examiners' findings released later, the beating Mya endured in that parking lot was severe. Broken ribs, a broken leg, the kind of injuries that don't happen in a brief scuffle. They happen over sustained, deliberate violence. Witnesses would later describe hearing an order shouted over the noise of the confrontation. 3 words that turn an assault into something far worse. Pop the trunk. Not call someone. Not she's had enough. Pop the trunk. Mya, beaten and overpowered, was forced into the trunk of the car. The lid came down. According to the case built by investigators, she was still alive when it did. It's worth pausing here to address something directly, because it's the kind of detail true crime audiences often ask about and deserve an honest answer to. A crowded nightclub parking lot. On paper, sounds like the least likely place for something like this to happen without anyone stepping in. Loud music, dozens or hundreds of people in the immediate area, security working the door. And yet, according to everything that came out over the course of this investigation, nobody intervened in time to stop what was happening. That's not a unique failure specific to this club or this night. It reflects something researchers who study bystander behavior have documented consistently for decades. Violence that unfolds quickly in the dark at the edge of crowds' attention is disturbingly easy for people nearby to misread, or assume someone else is already handling. It doesn't excuse what happened. It does help explain how a public, populated space became the setting for an abduction that nobody managed to stop in time. Stay with this moment for a second, because it's the center of everything that follows, and it deserves to be sat with rather than rushed past. That morning, Mya had been getting ready for a normal Saturday. That afternoon, she clocked out of a shift at a soccer stadium. That night, she'd said yes to 1 invitation from someone she'd never met. Now she was folded into the trunk of a car, while the 3 people responsible for putting her there climbed into the seats above her. Then they drove. according to the case laid out by prosecutors. They didn't stop at the parking lot. They got in the car and left Nashville entirely, crossing the county line into Wilson County. That's roughly a 30 to 40-minute drive, depending on the route. However long it actually took that night, Mya was alive for essentially all of it, locked in the dark, feeling every turn the car made, with no way to call out and no way of knowing where she was being taken. They ended up on a quiet, undeveloped stretch of Trammell Lane near Lebanon, in the southeastern portion of Wilson County, a piece of land under development at the time. No streetlights, no neighbors close enough to hear anything, just open fields and tree leans in every direction. They had taken Mya from a building full of hundreds of people, with cameras at the door and security on the floor, to a patch of ground with absolutely none of that. There, in the dark, the trunk open again. And according to the case prosecutors ultimately proved in court, Taiyana Tipton raised a gun and shot Mya Fuller 7 times. 7 separate shots, not a single panic discharge. 7 individual decisions, one after another. When it was done, according to investigators, they left her body there in the field and drove back toward Nashville, leaving a daughter, a co-worker, a friend, an entire person's future abandoned in a county she had no reason to have ever set foot in. Back home, the hours started passing with no word from Mya. For a family that knew she always stayed in touch, that silence became terrifying almost immediately. Calls rang through to nothing. Messages went unanswered. At first, the people who loved her reached for the explanations every family reaches for in those first few hours. Her phone died. She stayed at a friend's. She'll call in the morning. She did not call in the morning. There was one detail that made the growing dread even worse. Mya's gray Toyota Camry was found sitting exactly where she'd parked it in the lot outside Island Vibes. She had never come back for it. The car was there. Mya wasn't. For anyone who has ever waited by a phone for someone who should have called hours ago, you understand exactly what that detail does to a family's sense of hope. Mya was reported missing. Her name and description started moving through the community and through local law enforcement channels. Jeans, a shirt, bright pink Puma tennis shoes. Last known location, a nightclub on Antioch Pike near Harding Place. Days crawled by. Nothing came back. On August 6, 2022, roughly a week after Mya was last seen, the search ended, and it ended in the worst possible way. Out on that property off Trammell Lane, human remains were discovered in a wooded area behind a piece of land that was, at the time, in the middle of being developed for a new home. The discovery itself came from the family that had just purchased the land. According to local realtor Jason Anderson, who represented the sale, the new owners had noticed a strange odor while walking the property and assumed, understandably, that it might be an animal. There were buzzards circling overhead. When they walked further up the hill to investigate, they came across a pair of tennis shoes in the ground, in an area Anderson described as resembling an old bunker-style structure, partially hidden from view. The Wilson County Medical Examiner's office confirmed what the family had been dreading for a week. It was Mya. Cause of death, multiple gunshot wounds. And the examiner's findings confirmed what witnesses had described from that parking lot outside Island Vibes. The broken ribs, the broken leg. Physical proof of the beating she endured before she was ever forced into that trunk. None of what happened to Mya Fuller that night had been quick. None of it had been merciful. It's worth explaining briefly why it took roughly a week between Mya's disappearance and this discovery, because it's a detail that can otherwise read as a delay in the investigation when it wasn't. The property on Trammell Lane was privately owned, undeveloped land, not a location that appeared anywhere on the initial list of places connected to Mya's known movements that night. Investigators searching for a missing person typically start with confirmed locations. Her home, her workplace, the last confirmed sighting at the club, and the roads and areas immediately surrounding those points. A rural, 40-minute drive away, on a property with no known connection to Mya, her family, or anyone in her social circle, was never going to be an early search location without some piece of information pointing investigators toward it. In this case, that piece of information ultimately came not from law enforcement's search grid, but from pure, tragic circumstance, a family walking their newly purchased land days later.
How do you plead, Mr. Bowles?
Guilty.
This morning, Tyshawn Bowles waived his right to a trial, pleading guilty to a lesser charge of facilitation of especially aggravated kidnapping. for his role in the death of Mya Fuller.
What happened to her? It was despicable. It's still despicable.
He was originally indicted on kidnapping and first-degree murder charges. During today's plea hearing, the prosecutor detailed what happened on the night of July 30th, 2022. She says Bowles admitted to inviting Mya to a party on Antioch Pike after his sister met Mya for the first time the night before. According to the prosecutor, there is video evidence of the two having a conversation in a parking lot, but it's not clear what was said. The next night, Bowles watched as his sister, Taiyana, and Lamira Pipkins then beat Mya until she was knocked out.
I can't believe you let that happen to my child. I can't believe you just did nothing.
The prosecutor says Taiyana put Mya into a trunk, drove her to Wilson County, shot her 7 times, and left her body in the woods. Back in March, Tipton pleaded guilty to all charges related to her death.
Are you pleading guilty because you are guilty?
Yes, sir.
Today, Tipton's brother pleaded guilty for his role in Mya's death. His trial was set for this week, but took a plea deal instead.
My family do not agree with the deal, with the plea that has been made today.
District Attorney Jason Lawson spoke with News 2 after the hearing. He said proving Bowles had intent or knowledge that Mya would be kidnapped and harmed would have been difficult to prove.
I do believe that today's decision was the correct decision. Each person in this case had a different role to play and a different level of responsibility for what happened in this case.
But Mya's mother emotional in the courtroom, saying her family feels betrayed.
So I stand here again. My daughter, Mya Christine Fuller, did not deserve this despicable, heinous, mean, cruel act that came to her.
In Wilson County, Kendall Ashman, News 2.
There are 2 more defendants in this case. One suspect was involved in the beating at the club. The other accused of destroying Mya's phone that night. News 2 did reach out to Bowles' defense attorney, but have not heard back.
News of Mya's death didn't stay contained to Wilson County, or even to Nashville. It moved through Murfreesboro, through Rutherford County, through the entire network of people who had crossed paths with her over the years, at school, at work, in her neighborhood. Community members who had known Mya described the same reaction, over and over, in the days and weeks that followed. Disbelief that someone so unfailingly kind could have been the target of this kind of deliberate, coordinated violence. That reaction matters for a reason beyond simple sentiment. In cases where a victim has no known enemies and no obvious motive attached to their death, community response often becomes one of the most valuable investigative tools available. People who knew Mya, who had seen her at work, at school events, at family gatherings, were far more likely to notice and report anything unusual in the days surrounding her disappearance than a stranger reviewing case files ever could be. The reward fund, organized jointly by the Wilson County Sheriff's Office and the Fuller family's attorney, Brian Lewis, was designed specifically to activate exactly that kind of community knowledge, converting quiet suspicion or overheard information into an actual, actionable tip. If this story is landing the way I think it is, take 30 seconds right now and subscribe before we move into the investigation itself. Because what comes next, how detectives rebuilt this entire case from almost nothing, is honestly one of the more remarkable pieces of police work we've covered on this channel. We've got a lot of people watching right now who haven't subscribed yet, and every one of you who does helps this channel keep doing the deep, careful version of these stories instead of the fast, shallow one. All right, let's get into how they actually solved this. Understanding what detectives were actually up against here means understanding just how deliberately this crime had been scattered across jurisdictions. Mya lived in Rutherford County. She was last seen alive in Davidson County, outside a Nashville nightclub. Her body was found in Wilson County, roughly 40 minutes away, on a rural property nobody had any reason to visit. 3 different counties, 3 different sets of law enforcement, and a killer who had no obvious public connection to the victim at all. When investigators asked the single most fundamental question in any homicide case, who wanted this woman dead, the honest, unsettling answer was, nobody did. Not in any way that made sense on paper. Mya had no known enemies. No history with Taiyana Tipton beyond a 24-hour-old argument that hadn't even escalated to violence the first time. That is, in a strange and horrifying way, the entire engine of how this crime worked. There was no motive obvious enough to hand investigators a suspect on day one. But the Wilson County Sheriff's Office refused to let this become a case that quietly faded. Sheriff Robert Bryan made that explicitly clear at a press conference held not long after Mya's body was identified. That press conference, led by Captain Scott Moore as Public Information Officer, laid out the confirmed public timeline for the first time. Mya last seen by family on July 29th. Her shift at Geodes Park on July 30th. Her last known location at Island Vibes Lake that night into the early morning of July 31st. Her vehicle recovered near the club. And her body discovered on Trammell Lane on August 6th. Investigators also confirmed something critical for the public to understand, that they had already identified several persons of interest and were actively pursuing multiple leads, both technological and conventional, though they could not name names at that stage without compromising the integrity of the case. The sheriff's office also announced a reward, initially $1,000, later increased publicly to $5,000 for information leading to identification and prosecution. It's worth noting how many separate agencies ultimately touched this case before it reached the courtroom, because that detail speaks directly to how genuinely complicated jurisdiction becomes in a crime that's deliberately or even incidentally spread across county lines. The Wilson County Sheriff's Office led the homicide investigation, since that's where Mya's body was recovered. But Metro Nashville Police had jurisdiction over the abduction itself, since that occurred in Davidson County outside Island Vibes. Rutherford County, where Mya lived and was reported missing by her family, was involved in the earliest stages of a missing persons response. And the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, which frequently assists local agencies on cases that cross multiple jurisdictions or require forensic resources smaller county offices don't have in-house, played a coordinating role as well. That kind of multi-agency coordination doesn't happen automatically or quickly. It requires formal information sharing agreements, coordinated timelines, and a level of institutional cooperation that isn't always guaranteed, particularly in cases where no single agency has full ownership of every piece of evidence. The fact that this case moved from a body discovery in August 2022 to formal indictments roughly a year later, in a case with no immediately obvious suspect, reflects genuinely disciplined, sustained work across all those agencies simultaneously, not the work of any single department acting alone. Standing alongside law enforcement that day was attorney Brian Lewis, representing the Fuller family, who confirmed that friends and family across the country had independently raised $16,000 for a private reward fund, bringing the combined total to roughly $21,000 for information. Lewis, who had previously worked a similar reward fund in another Nashville case, explained plainly why that mattered. Sometimes it takes exactly that kind of incentive to pry loose a tip that someone has been sitting on out of fear or hesitation. At that same press conference, a reporter asked Lewis to describe who Mya actually was as a person beyond the case file. His answer was simple, and it's worth repeating here because it's the entire emotional center of the story in 6 words. She was very tender-hearted, kind, and loving. The Q&A portion of that press conference is worth spending a little more time on, because it shows exactly how careful investigators had to be at that early stage, balancing the public's demand for information against the very real risk of compromising a case that was still entirely open. One reporter asked directly whether investigators had any video evidence of Mya leaving the club with a specific person. The answer was a firm, practiced non-answer. That information remained privileged to the ongoing investigation. Another reporter asked whether law enforcement had been in contact with the ownership of Island Vibes itself. Investigators confirmed they had spoken with multiple business owners in the surrounding area, including the club, but again declined to specify what, if anything, had been learned from those conversations. That kind of careful, deliberately vague public communication frustrates viewers and reporters alike in the moment, and it's a completely understandable reaction, but it exists for a specific, defensible reason. Investigators who reveal too much too early risk-giving suspects, who may still be actively watching news coverage of their own case, the information they need to alter their story, destroy evidence, or coordinate their accounts with each other before formal charges are filed. Every vague answer given at that early press conference was, In hindsight, protecting the very case that would eventually convict all 3 defendants. With no obvious suspect and no obvious motive, investigators had to do the slow, unglamorous work that actually solves cases like this one, rebuilding, hour by hour, everything Mya did in her final hours alive and cross-referencing it against everyone she came into contact with. They had 2 real threads to pull. The first was physical evidence recovered directly at the scene on Trammell Lane. 7 shell casings scattered in the grass around where Mya's body was found, a direct physical match to the number of gunshot wounds documented by the medical examiner. The second thread was the club itself. Detectives worked to confirm Island Vibes as Mya's last known location, and according to statements made at a later press conference, they had multiple independent sources confirming that location beyond just a recovered vehicle, though investigators declined at the time to specify exactly what that additional confirmation consisted of. They also confirmed they had spoken with multiple business owners in that area, including the club itself, though again, specifics were withheld to protect the integrity of an active investigation. And then there was the invitation itself, the single piece of digital evidence that would ultimately unravel the entire case. A social media message that lured Mya to that parking lot doesn't just disappear once it's served its purpose. It leaves a trail. The account that sent it had a name attached. That name had a sibling, and that sibling had, according to witnesses, stood face-to-face with Mya in an argument the night before she disappeared. Piece by piece, over the course of months, investigators built a connective tissue between an argument nobody outside that immediate circle had witnessed, a message sent from a stranger's account, and a body found 40 minutes away in a different county entirely. It's worth slowing down here to explain exactly why the digital side of this investigation mattered as much as it did, because it's the single clearest illustration of how modern homicide cases actually get solved in 2022 and beyond. A generation ago, a case with no obvious suspect, no witness who saw the actual killing, and a body dumped 40 minutes from the scene of the abduction might genuinely have gone cold. What changed the equation here wasn't a fingerprint or a confession. It was a direct message. Every social media platform leaves a trail behind a message, even a deleted one, even one sent from an account with no obvious connection to the sender's real identity. Timestamps, device metadata, login records, IP addresses. None of that shows up in the dramatic, cinematic version of a homicide investigation, but it is, in cases exactly like this one, often the entire backbone of how prosecutors ultimately connect a suspect to a crime scene they were never physically photographed at. According to the case laid out by prosecutors, investigators were able to trace the message that invited Mya to Island Vibes back to an account connected to Tyshawn Bowles. Once that connection existed, everything else in the timeline started to fall into a coherent sequence. Bowles' relationship to Taiyana Tipton as her brother, Tipton's documented argument with Mya the night before, and the surveillance footage confirming Mya's presence at the club that same night. None of those individual facts, on their own, would have been enough to build a prosecutable case. Together, cross-referenced against each other and against a timeline built almost entirely from digital records, they became the spine of a case strong enough that 2 of the 3 defendants ultimately chose to plead guilty rather than face a jury. This is also, quietly, one of the more important lessons buried inside this entire case. The idea that a message sent from an unfamiliar account somehow disappears once it's been read and acted on is simply not true anymore, and it hasn't been true for years. Every digital interaction leaves something behind. In Mya's case, that trail is ultimately what turned an unsolvable-looking murder into a fully prosecuted one. There's something worth highlighting about how the reward fund in this case actually came together, because it reflects a broader shift in how communities respond to unsolved violent crimes in the social media era. The Wilson County Sheriff's Office initially offered $1,000, a modest but standard starting figure for this kind of appeal. What happened next wasn't driven by law enforcement at all. Friends, extended family, and members of the broader community, many of whom had never met Mya personally but had seen her story shared online, contributed independently through attorney Brian Lewis's escrow account, eventually raising $16,000 on their own. Combined with the sheriff's office's increased $5,000 offer and additional Crime Stoppers funding, the total reached roughly $21,000. That figure matters beyond its role as an investigative tool. It represents something genuinely important about how true crime cases resolve in the current era. The line between official investigation and public response has become much thinner than it used to be. Attorney Lewis himself referenced this directly at the press conference, noting that he had run a similar reward fund in a previous Nashville case that had directly led to an arrest and prosecution. Communities, when given a concrete, actionable way to participate in seeking justice for someone, consistently show up. That's not a replacement for professional investigative work. It's a supplement to it, and in cases exactly like this one, where the actual break came from a digital trail investigators had to painstakingly reconstruct rather than a single anonymous tip, it's a reminder that pressure, attention, and community involvement create the conditions that allow that painstaking work to actually get the institutional priority it needs. While that investigation moved forward, quietly and methodically, Mya's family lived through every single milestone without her. A Thanksgiving with an empty chair. A Christmas that didn't feel like Christmas. A New Year she never got to see. Through all of it, Taiyana Fuller kept her daughter's name in front of anyone who would listen, driven by the very real fear that public attention might fade before the truth ever surfaced. Families in this position carry two jobs simultaneously. They grieve. At the same time, they fight to make sure the rest of the world doesn't get to stop grieving alongside them, or worse, forget entirely. Then, roughly a year after Mya's body was found, a grand jury handed down indictments. Officers moved in across Nashville. 3 arrests: Taiyana Tipton, Taishawn Bowles, and Lamyra Pipkins, each one charged with first-degree murder and kidnapping. Tipton was additionally charged with abuse of a corpse. News crews covering the arrests noted something that reporters and detectives alike found genuinely important to establish on the record. This was not an ongoing feud, not a long-term rivalry, not people who had known each other for years and built up resentment over time. As one investigator put it plainly in a televised interview, these parties did not know each other. These individuals had become acquainted over the course of the previous 24 hours. Detectives confirmed they had multiple forms of surveillance video supporting the case against all 3 suspects, though the exact content of that footage remained under seal ahead of trial. All 3 suspects were booked into the Wilson County Jail and held without bond. Okay, I need you to do something for me before we move into the courtroom, because this next section is where the legal side of this case gets genuinely complicated, and I don't want anybody missing it because they clicked away too early. If you're finding this channel's breakdowns useful, actually useful, not just entertaining, take a second and subscribe right now. And here's something specific I want from you this time. Once we get into the sentencing breakdown coming up, I want you to comment the word ledger, because by the time we get there, you're going to understand exactly why that word fits this case better than almost any other one we've covered. All right, let's go into the courtroom. Before we get into how each of these 3 cases actually resolved, it's worth pausing to explain what these charges actually mean under Tennessee law, because the outcomes that follow make a lot more sense once you understand the legal architecture behind them. First-degree murder under Tennessee law generally requires proof of a premeditated, intentional killing, or in certain circumstances, a killing that occurs during the commission of another serious felony, such as kidnapping. That second category matters enormously here, because it's exactly the theory prosecutors use to charge all 3 defendants with murder, regardless of who actually pulled the trigger. Under Tennessee's felony murder framework, someone can face a first-degree murder charge for a death that occurs during a kidnapping they participated in, even if they weren't the one who fired the fatal shots. That's why Lamyra Pipkins, who prosecutors say helped beat Mya alongside Tipton but did not personally fire a weapon, was still charged with first-degree murder during the commission of a kidnapping. Kidnapping charges in Tennessee escalate in severity, depending on the circumstances, and especially aggravated kidnapping. The specific charge connected to Taishawn Bowles' eventual plea applies when a kidnapping involves the use of a deadly weapon or results in serious bodily injury. Facilitation charges, which both Bowles and eventually Pipkins pled to in reduced form, apply to someone who knowingly furnishes substantial assistance to another person committing a crime, without necessarily sharing that person's specific intent to complete the full offense. In plain terms, the law recognizes a real difference between the person who plans and carries out a killing and the person who provides a means for it to happen without necessarily intending or foreseeing that it would end in death. That distinction is going to be the single most contested part of everything that follows, particularly for Mya's own family. It's also worth understanding briefly how sentencing and parole eligibility actually work in Tennessee, because the numbers attached to each of these three pleas mean something very different depending on that context. A life sentence in Tennessee, under current law, generally carries a minimum service requirement before parole eligibility that can stretch to several decades, meaning that in practical terms, a life sentence for a defendant sentenced in her 20s functions, for almost all realistic purposes, as a sentence that will keep her incarcerated for the remainder of her natural life. That's the sentence Taiyana Tipton received. Determinate sentences, like the 12 years given to Tyshawn Bowles and the 20 years given to Lamira Pipkins, work differently, depending on the specific offense classification and any credits earned through good behavior or program participation while incarcerated. A defendant can become eligible for release well before the full numerical term is served. This is exactly the detail Mya's family raised concern about publicly. A 12-year sentence does not necessarily mean 12 years actually served. And that gap between the number read aloud in a courtroom and the number of years someone genuinely spends behind bars is one of the most consistently misunderstood aspects of the American sentencing system for anyone who hasn't had to sit through a case like this one personally. None of this is a criticism of the legal system in the abstract. It's simply the honest mechanical reality underneath the sentences handed down in this case. And understanding it is the only way to actually understand why Mya's family reacted to Bowles' plea deal the way they did. Justice in this case did not arrive all at once. It came in 3 separate pieces, spread out across nearly a year, and each one reopened the wound for Mya's family in a different way. The first piece came in March 2025. Taiyana Tipton was days away from trial. A jury was about to be selected when, during what was supposed to be a routine pretrial hearing, the defense informed the court that Tipton had decided to plead guilty to everything: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. District Attorney Jason Lawson later told reporters the plea genuinely caught even his own office off guard. They had been fully prepared to take the case before a jury. Lawson confirmed publicly what prosecutors had built their case around. Tipton was the shooter, and she was the one who orchestrated Mya being forced into that trunk. With the help of her brother and a friend, he explained, they transported Mya's body across the county line into Wilson County, where she was later found. The judge sentenced Taiyana Tipton on the spot, life in prison. The woman who pulled the trigger 7 times will not be walking free again. Jeremy Barbie, Mya's former basketball coach at Blackman High School, spoke publicly in the aftermath of the plea, and his words capture something that gets lost easily in the legal mechanics of a case like this one. That a former high school coach was still willing to speak publicly about Mya years after she graduated says something important about the kind of impression she left on people. Coaches, teachers, and mentors move through hundreds, sometimes thousands, of students over the course of a career, and most of those relationships naturally fade once a student moves on. The ones that don't fade, the ones a coach still remembers clearly enough to speak about on camera years later, without hesitation, tend to be the students who genuinely stood out, not necessarily for athletic achievement, but for character. For being, in Barbie's own word, a sweet soul. That's not a scripted talking point crafted for a news camera. That's the kind of description that only holds up under pressure, because it was true well before any of this happened. It's a detail worth sitting with as this case moves toward its legal conclusion, because it's easy, in the middle of explaining facilitation charges and sentencing guidelines and jurisdictional overlap, to lose sight of the fact that every single procedural detail in this script exists because of one specific person, and the people who loved her are still out there, still carrying her memory forward in exactly the way Coach Barbie did in that interview. Taiyana Tipton's decision to plead guilty just days before a jury was set to be seated is worth pausing on, because of the pattern that shows up constantly in cases with overwhelming physical and digital evidence, and understanding why helps explain the timeline of this entire case. By the time Tipton's trial date approached, prosecutors had assembled a case built on multiple independent, corroborating threads. The digital trail connecting the invitation to her brother's account, witness statements from the scene outside Island Vibes, 7 shell casings recovered at the location where Mya's body was found, an exact match to the 7 gunshot wounds documented by the medical examiner, and surveillance footage confirming Mya's presence at the club that night. For a defense attorney assessing that evidence honestly ahead of trial, a guilty plea, particularly one entered before a jury is seated, can sometimes result in outcomes that avoid the harshest possible sentencing exposure a trial conviction might carry, even when, as in Tipton's case, the plea still results in a life sentence. District Attorney Jason Lawson's own comments after the plea, that his office was fully prepared to proceed to trial, suggest this wasn't a case where prosecutors extended a lenient offer to avoid the expense or uncertainty of trial. It suggests, instead, that the defense recognized the strength of the evidence and made a calculated decision that a guilty plea was the only remaining path forward. That's an important distinction for viewers to understand, because guilty plea and plea deal are often used interchangeably in casual conversation, but they're not always the same thing. Tipton's guilty plea to all charges as originally filed, with a life sentence attached, reflects the former. Bowles's and Pipkins's guilty pleas to reduced facilitation-based charges reflect the latter, a genuine negotiated agreement between prosecution and defense. Both are legitimate outcomes within the justice system. They simply represent very different processes, and they explain why the three sentences in the single case ended up looking so different from one another. The second piece of this case landed roughly 7 months later, in October 2025, and it landed very differently for Mya's family. Tyshawn Bowles, the brother who found Mya's profile, sent the invitation, and by his own account watched what happened afterward, did not plead guilty to murder. He pled to a significantly reduced charge, facilitation of especially aggravated kidnapping. His sentence was 12 years, with a possibility of release after serving only a portion of that time under Tennessee's standard sentencing guidelines. In the plea hearing, more of Bowles' actual role in that night came out on the record. He admitted he was present. He admitted he watched the beating unfold in that parking lot. He even admitted he heard his sister give the order to pop the trunk, but he claimed, according to statements made in court, that he never actually saw Mya physically placed inside the vehicle, that it followed his sister's car for a stretch and then lost sight of it in the dark before it crossed into Wilson County. District Attorney Jason Lawson explained the legal reasoning behind the reduced charge directly to reporters afterward. In plain terms, prosecutors concluded that while Bowles had absolutely lured Mya into the situation that led to her death, they could not prove, to the standard required for a murder conviction, that he personally intended or actively participated in the killing itself. The evidence showed he opened the door. It did not, in the state's assessment, prove he walked through it. That legal reasoning did very little to soften the moment for Mya's mother. In the courtroom, Mya Fuller stood and addressed the outcome directly. News 2 reporter Kendall Ashman, who had followed this case from the very beginning, later confirmed publicly that Mya's family did not agree with the plea deal that had been reached. Think about the math here for a moment, because it's genuinely difficult to reconcile. The man whose actions set this entire chain of events into motion, the one who found a stranger online, studied her page, wrote a message designed to earn her trust, and sent it, without whom none of what happened that night would have been possible, received the lightest sentence of 3 people ultimately held responsible. 12 years, with a legal pathway to release after serving only a portion of that. All right, before we get into the third and final plea in this case, and how the numbers on all 3 sentences actually stack up against each other, I want to make sure you're subscribed, because if this kind of case breakdown is valuable to you, this channel only keeps producing them at this depth as long as the people watching decide to actually stick around and follow. And remember that word I asked you to hold on to, ledger. Drop in the comments right now if you're already starting to see why it fits. Let's finish this out. The final piece of this case did not resolve until March 2026, nearly 4 years after Mya Fuller was murdered. Lamyra Pipkins held out the longest of the 3 defendants. Her case was the last one still standing. On the morning a jury was set to be seated for her trial, Pipkins pled guilty as well to facilitation of first-degree murder. Her sentence, 20 years. With that plea, all 3 cases connected to Mya Fuller's murder were finally formally closed. 3 guilty pleas. 3 people answering, in very different measures, for the death of one 22-year-old woman. Here is where that word I asked you to hold on to actually earns its place in this story, because when you lay these 3 outcomes side by side, what you're looking at is genuinely a ledger, an accounting of who paid what for a single night of coordinated violence. Taiyana Tipton, the woman who pulled the trigger 7 times, who orchestrated the invitation, who gave the order to pop the trunk, received a life sentence. She will grow old and likely die behind bars. LaMyra Pipkins, who prosecutors say helped physically beat Mya to the ground alongside Tipton in that parking lot, received 20 years for facilitation of first-degree murder. Tyshawn Bowles, the one who went hunting through social media for a stranger who studied her profile, who composed and sent a message that pulled her out of her own life and into that parking lot, without whom none of the rest of the sequence of events was even possible, received 12 years for facilitation of especially aggravated kidnapping, with the legal possibility of release after serving only a portion of that sentence. Look at how that punishment actually lands when you set it against each person's role. The hand that pulled the trigger received the harshest sentence. The hands that held Mya down while she was beaten received the second harshest. And the hand that struck the very first match, the one that made every single subsequent moment of that night possible, received the lightest sentence of the three, with an earlier door back out into the world than either of his co-defendants. District Attorney Jason Lawson's explanation for that discrepancy is legally sound. Intent is what the law actually punishes, not just involvement, proving that Bowles knew Mya would be beaten and killed, rather than simply confronted or embarrassed, was, in the prosecution's own assessment, a genuinely difficult evidentiary bar, a clear beyond a reasonable doubt. That's not a flaw in this particular case. That's how the concept of degrees of culpability is built into the entire American legal system, and it's worth understanding rather than simply being angry about. But understanding the legal reasoning and accepting the emotional outcome are two completely different things, and nothing about that distinction has been lost on Mya's family. For them, the sentence handed to the person who lured their daughter into a parking lot she had no reason to fear will never fully reconcile with the fact that without his one message, she would very likely still be alive today. There's also a broader question worth sitting with here, one that extends well beyond the single case and into how the justice system handles accomplice liability more generally. Should the person who plans and enables a crime, without personally carrying out its most violent moments, ever be held to the same standard as the person who does? Reasonable people, including experienced prosecutors and defense attorneys, disagree on this fairly consistently. Some argue that intent is the only fair measure, that punishing someone as severely as an actual killer, when the evidence doesn't clearly show they wanted or foresaw a death, undermines the entire purpose of having degrees of culpability in the law at all. Others argue that without Bowles' specific, deliberate action, sending that message, studying that profile, waiting to see if Mya would say yes, nothing that followed would have been possible, and that the law should weigh that originating act more heavily than it currently does. There is no clean resolution to that tension, and this case doesn't offer one. What it does offer is a remarkably clear, almost textbook illustration of exactly how that tension plays out in a real courtroom, with a real family sitting in the gallery, watching the math get decided in front of them. Closing a case is never the same thing as making it right. No sentence, however long, answers the actual question Mya's family has been left holding every single day since July of 2022. Why? Why does one disagreement, words on a Friday night, the kind of exchange most people forget by Monday morning, and with a daughter shot 7 times and left in a field she'd never once set foot in before that night? How do 3 people, none of them older than 21, look at a young woman who had never done a single thing to any of them and choose one deliberate step at a time across an entire day to take everything from her? There's a pattern worth naming here plainly, because it's the actual mechanism that makes this case matter beyond its own borders. The invite that ended Mya Fuller's life did not look dangerous. It looked exactly like a normal Saturday night. It arrived through a screen from someone who presented himself as harmless, and it cost her absolutely everything. That's not a detail specific to this one case. That a genuine, growing pattern in how violence finds its way to people in 2022, 2023, and today. Not through strangers lurking in alleys, but through completely mundane, completely unremarkable act accepting an invitation from someone a screen tells you is safe. This is also unavoidably a story about how quickly cruelty can move once 3 people decide, together, to enable it. Every single person in this chain, Tipton, Bowles, and Pipkins, had multiple, separate opportunities to stop what was happening before it became irreversible. A message unsent. A car not driven across a county line. A trunk left closed. At every one of those junctures, somebody could have chosen differently. Nobody did. Mya's case is not, unfortunately, an isolated example of how social media has changed the mechanics of violence between strangers or near strangers. Law enforcement agencies across the country have increasingly flagged the use of direct messaging platforms as a tool for luring victims into ambushes, precisely because it solves the one logistical problem that used to make premeditated attacks between people who barely know each other so difficult to pull off: getting the victim to willingly show up somewhere. Before social media made this kind of targeted outreach effortless, someone planning to harm a person they barely knew faced a real obstacle. They have to find that person in the physical world, follow them, or rely on a mutual acquaintance to set up an encounter, all of which carry a much higher risk of the plan falling apart or being witnessed. A direct message removes almost all of that friction. It can be sent from any account, studied and revised before it's sent, and delivered in a way that feels completely unremarkable to the person receiving it, because it looks exactly like the hundreds of other ordinary messages that person receives from acquaintances, promoters, and friends of friends every single week. This is precisely why Taiyana Tipton's role in this case, despite receiving the lightest sentence of the three defendants, deserves to be understood as genuinely foundational to what happened. He didn't need violence, deception about his identity, or even much effort. He needed a profile, a search bar, and roughly the time it takes to type a few sentences. That is the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this entire case. The barrier between an ordinary Saturday night and a premeditated ambush has, in the social media era, become almost non-existent. None of this is meant to suggest that people should stop accepting invitations from acquaintances or live in a state of constant suspicion toward anyone they haven't known for years. That's neither realistic nor healthy, and it would be the wrong lesson to take from Mya's story. The actual lesson is closer to something Mya's own family and community have emphasized in the years since her death: awareness, not fear. Understanding that the modern version of danger doesn't always look like a stranger in a dark alley. Sometimes it looks exactly like a normal invitation from someone your social circle makes feel familiar. Even when you've never actually met them, there's a practical dimension to that awareness worth naming plainly, not as a scare tactic, but as a kind of small, low-cost habit that genuinely does reduce risk without requiring anyone to live differently. Letting someone know where you're going and who invited you, even with a quick, casual text to a friend or family member before you head out, costs nothing and takes seconds. It wouldn't have prevented what happened to Mya in isolation, since her disappearance was in fact reported quickly once her family realized something was wrong. But it's exactly the kind of habit that, across countless other cases just like this one, has meant the difference between a fast, focused search and a case that takes days or weeks longer to even properly begin. Small, unremarkable precautions, not paranoia, not isolation, just a habit of staying loosely connected and accounted for, remain one of the few genuinely effective tools any of us have against a threat that, by its very design, is built to look completely harmless right up until the moment it isn't. We're almost at the end of this one, and I want to genuinely thank you for staying with this story all the way through, because cases like Mya's deserve exactly that kind of attention, not a quick scroll past a headline. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is genuinely the last moment I'm going to ask. So take the 2 seconds now. And one more thing before we close this out. Drop the word "remember" in the comments below if you want Mya's name to actually mean something beyond this one video, because that's ultimately the entire point of everything we do on this channel. Before we close this out, it's worth being precise about exactly what this case does and does not definitively answer, because that distinction matters to us as much as the story itself. Confirmed through court proceedings, official press conferences, and guilty pleas entered by all three defendants. The timeline of Mya's final weekend, the location and nature of the argument between Mya and Taiyana Tipton the night before her death, the digital message sent from Taiyana Tipton's account inviting Mya to island vibes, the assault in the parking lot outside that club, Mya being forced into the trunk of Tipton's vehicle, the drive into Wilson County, the shooting on Trammell Lane, and the recovery of Mya's remains on August 6th, 2022. Also confirmed, the specific charges, pleas, and sentences ultimately handed down to all three defendants, disputed or contested, at least in terms of degree. the exact scope of Tyshawn Bowles' knowledge and intent leading into that night, specifically whether he anticipated the level of violence that ultimately occurred. This is the central point of disagreement between the prosecution's legal reasoning for his reduced charge and Mya's family's own assessment of his culpability, still unknown or at least never made fully public. The precise word-for-word content of the argument between Mya and Taiyana Tipton on July 29th, the specific contents of the surveillance footage investigators referenced but did not release in detail, and any deeper personal motive beyond wounded pride that might explain why an ordinary disagreement escalated to this level of premeditated violence. Prosecutors and investigators have never claimed to fully understand that last piece, and neither do we. Some questions in cases like this one simply don't have satisfying answers, even after a full legal resolution. Mya Fuller was 22 years old. Her own mother called her a genius, and meant it without a shred of exaggeration. She was tender-hearted, according to the family's own attorney, standing in front of cameras trying to describe a person reduced by tragedy to a case file. She was kind to the people around her. She showed up to her shifts. She stayed close to her family. She had, by every single account available to us, a long life reasonably ahead of her. All of it ended over an argument that, by the accounts of everyone involved, wasn't even particularly serious. Words exchanged on a Friday night that most people, in any other version of this story, would have forgotten by the following weekend. If there's a warning worth carrying forward from Mya's story, it's an uncomfortable one, but it's honest. The invitation that ended her life did not announce itself as dangerous. It looked, in every meaningful way, like an ordinary Saturday night. It came through a screen, from someone who seemed harmless enough to say yes to, and it cost her everything she had left to live. Be careful who you trust on the other end of a message you didn't expect. Be careful whose invitation you accept without a second thought. And if you're ever the one carrying a grudge against someone you barely know, walk away from it. Because you genuinely never know, with absolute certainty, what someone else might be willing to do with that same anger. Mya's light was taken from her, deliberately, by 3 people who had an entire day to reconsider and chose not to. But her name does not have to fade the way this case, for a while, threatened to. Mya Christine Fuller, 22 years old, a daughter, a friend, a co-worker who showed up for her shifts, a young woman who deserved decades more than the single weekend she was given. There's something Tanya Fuller said, standing in a courtroom years after her daughter's death. That deserves to be the actual ending of this story rather than a passing quote buried in the middle of it. She stood there, having already lived through a life sentence for one defendant, a plea deal she publicly disagreed with for another, and still more waiting for a third. And she said the only thing left to say once the legal process has run its course and taken everything it was ever going to give her, all we have is to trust the justice system. That's all we have. Not because the system gave her family everything they wanted. It didn't by their own account. But because, in the end, after a year of searching, after a trial date that never needed to happen because 2 defendants folded before it began, after a third case that dragged out for nearly 4 years, trust in that process was the only thing left standing between this family and complete despair. That's not a triumphant ending. It's an honest one. And honest endings are the only kind Mya's story, or any victim's story, actually deserves. We've covered a lot of cases on this channel where the ending is genuinely ambiguous, where guilt is still contested, where a family is still waiting years later for even a single answer. This case is different in that specific respect. All 3 people responsible for what happened to Mya Fuller have been identified, charged, convicted through their own guilty pleas, and sentenced. In the strictest legal sense, this case is closed. But closed and finished are not the same word, and they never really are, not for a family living with this loss every single day, and not, frankly, for anyone who sits with this story long enough to actually absorb what happened to a 22-year-old woman who did nothing wrong except say yes to an invitation on an ordinary Saturday night. If this story stayed with you the way it stayed with us while researching it, take a moment and hold on to her name. If you have any information related to unsolved elements of this case, or others like it, reach out to the Wilson County Sheriff's Office directly. And if Mya's story moved you even slightly, share this video. Because the only real defense any of us have against cases like this one fading into forgotten headlines is people choosing deliberately to keep saying the victim's name. None of what's written in this script changes what happened to Mya Fuller. No amount of careful research, no courtroom testimony, no sentencing hearing, and no video like this one could undo a single second of what she went through in that parking lot, in that trunk, or in that field. That's the part of true crime storytelling that's easy to lose sight in the search for a satisfying narrative arc. There isn't one here. There's a 22-year-old woman who should still be alive, 3 people who made a choice they can never take back, and a family that will carry the weight of July 30th, 2022 for the rest of their lives, regardless of what any courtroom ultimately decided. What we can do, the only thing any of us watching from the outside can actually do, is refuse to let her become just another case number scrolling past in a feed. Say her name. Remember the shift she worked at that stadium the same day she died. Remember that her mother called her a genius and meant every word of it. That's not closure. Closure was never really on the table here. But it's something, and for a story like this one, something is worth holding on to. Rest in peace, Mya Fuller.